All right, welcome all to this Science of Math webinar. Tonight, our focus is on math anxiety and executive functioning. My name is Sarah Powell. I'm from the University of Texas at Austin, and I'm a fill-in MC tonight. Corey Peltier was going to lead this session, but he was unable to make it. We are so excited to be joined tonight by Robin Codding from Northeastern University and Matt Burns from the University of Missouri. So what we're going to do is we're going to watch a conversation between Corey and Robin and Matt related to math anxiety and executive functioning. This conversation will last just about 13 minutes. And as you listen to the conversation, if you would drop any questions that you have for Robin or Matt or both, drop those in the chat, then I will ask those questions to them after we return from the video segment. If at any time you have a question or a comment, please drop it in the chat. I'm able to see all of those. I don't think the whole group is able to see those questions. And we'll have about 30 minutes for questions after we do the video. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, thank you, Matt and Robin, for putting together that recording. Really, really awesome and very helpful. I'm monitoring the chat now. So just two comments before we get started here. One, some of you have already asked for the links to the articles that either Robin or Matt talked about. They will share those with our team. And then when we post this on the Science of Math YouTube channel, all of those links will be embedded in the YouTube description. So they are forthcoming. We will share them probably tomorrow. That's when we'll get those up and running. And then start dropping your questions in the chat. I've already got a few questions to ask Matt and Robin, but we hope to get your question in there as well. So let's go ahead and get started. Robin, the first question is going to come to you. This is not a question from the chat, but this is something I was thinking about while we were watching the video. One of the things that I hear all the time is about how timed math tests cause math anxiety. So is that true? And would you like to comment on that?
Sure. Actually, my graduate students, I train school psychologists. And so about 5 to 7 years ago, I would say, they started coming back to me and saying that they were not allowed to do progress monitoring in school because those tests were timed. They weren't allowed to use some of the instructional practice techniques that we were doing in the classroom in their school system. And so really based on their feedback and what was happening on their sites, they actually suggested that we go ahead and see if that is true. So we investigated that very idea. So what we were attempting to do was a systematic review, and ultimately what we found in the K-12 arena is 2 empirical studies. And both those empirical studies, one of them was a very clear test of timed tests and math anxiety, and the other was not. It was a study on gifted students, and it included things like perfectionism. So there was a much more to it than just that simple question. But the one study that we had, it was Grays and colleagues, and they actually identified that all students did better with the timed task and under the timed test condition, and there wasn't an issue at all related to timed test or task, which were both used in this particular study. The timed task, the timed activity, practice activity that they employed. So there's 2 issues really that we're talking about here. So the timed activity that they employed actually improved the performance of all students, including those that were identified with high math anxiety.
Oh, wow. That's really interesting. Ooh, I hope you'll share that one with our group. I think a lot of people would like to read that study there. Matt, would you like to comment at all on this, time test causing math anxiety? Kind of, I'll say it's a myth that's out there.
Yeah, it is a myth. I don't really know. I guess I have a hypothesis where it came from, but I'll do a real quick story. I was doing a training on how to do math RTI in a school district, and was talking about if you have a class-wide need, you have a whole bunch of kids who struggle with math. My class-wide intervention, which I learned from Amanda Vanderheyden, is basically math fact practice. And I was talking about that, and we saw great results. And the assistant superintendent handed me a piece of paper and said, "How do you respond to this article, this study?" I said, "Well, I didn't say it, so I'm thinking you pay me a great deal of money to stand here in front of your teachers and have this conversation, but okay." And it was a blog. I won't say who it was by. It's a pretty well-known blog, pretty well-known author. And basically talked about math anxiety how kids can't access working memory if they're experiencing math anxiety. And if a kid has difficulties with math anxiety, we shouldn't practice math facts.
Mm-hmm.
Well, no, that's not how it works. Okay, yes, you have to access working memory, and math anxiety or anxiety in general can interfere with that. But if the children learn to the point of automaticity, you bypass working memory, the importance of working memory in that equation. And so if the child has anxiety at all, one of the best things you can do is teach automaticity and practice. So that takes working memory out of the system, or it doesn't take it out of it, but reduces the role of working memory. So I'm not sure where the myth came from, but I do think it's problematic. And I still would argue one of the best things you can do, even for kids who have just a general anxiety issue, is to teach them their math facts to automaticity and practice them.
Well, one of the things in some of my experience, Matt, that I've noticed is that it doesn't take a long time in maybe each math session to practice this automaticity. We do some intervention efforts where we practice for 2 minutes of every 30 or 40-minute session. And we see that really helps students. We're looking at word problem solving, but those 2 minutes of working on addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division then really transfer to helping students be better word problem solvers. And so, we just do these 2 minutes a day. And that's, it's just gets us started, and then it makes a really big impact on the students. So, all right, we've got some questions that have been coming in from the chat. So Matt, one of the things that you mentioned is you talked about maybe not focusing on executive functioning in mathematics, but actually focusing on effective math instruction. So when you say that, what are some of the things that you mean?
Well, I base it on one study. I based it on lots of things, but that exact point was on this study we did. So I when reading the literature on executive functioning, consistently multiple people, I referenced this last time, said that of all the areas of executive function, working memory seems to be the one that predicts math the best. So I looked at it, and yeah, working memory did predict math really well among kids who were struggling learners. But when we had kids teach kids some math facts, just to really kind of isolate the skill, and we used sort of traditional drill and kill, just practice. We saw a relationship that was quite significant. We saw 34% of the variance be attributed to working memory, for example. But that was great. So, but when we did incremental rehearsal, so a much more effective way to build automaticity of math facts, that seemed to then factor out the effect that working memory had, took that student level variable and kind of negated it, and got the variance down to about 4%. So quite low.
Yeah.
So that was just in reference to that study we did. But as the things that Robin talked about earlier, any of these things that enhance automaticity, any of these things that can build fluency of the skill, et cetera, the practice you were mentioning, Sarah. And by the way, when math fact practice is the intervention, it's the 2-minute time thing you were talking about, Sarah, plus 5 minutes of practice. So it's 7 minutes. We're talking about not needing much time. Yeah, it's 7 minutes. That's the intervention. So it doesn't take a lot of time. So practice with it, explicit instruction in it, practice generalizing it, practice using it. And these are all just good, effective practices we know are much better targets for intervention than anything we do along the lines of enhancing working memory.
Great. Thanks for that information, Matt. All right. We have another question from the chat. Robin, this one's coming to you. You were talking about maybe like thinking about how you could address math anxiety in intervention. Can you do that? Or what would you say are some suggestions that you have when we're doing math intervention with students who are experiencing math anxiety?
So I think, there's a couple approaches that have been illustrated in the literature. The first thing, though, is to make sure that we understand where the math anxiety component is coming from. So are we asking students to engage in activities that are misaligned with what they're actually capable of doing at the moment? So they have the prerequisite skills? Because not having the prerequisite skills can really cause a lot of anxiety if students are required to do something that's more challenging. So the answer to that problem would of course be address prerequisite skills and then provide some kind of accommodation for the students in order to engage in those higher level skill concepts while they are missing those prerequisite skills. And then I think, the math anxiety literature, the empirical studies on how to address math anxiety is limited.
Okay.
Mentioned that we just did that systematic review. There was a lot of different approaches that were taken on the therapeutic side. A lot of them are things like relaxation and breathing exercises that could be embedded into, before engaging in some of these math tasks and activities, or even throughout. That's something that our research team is interested in investigating. And then there's, more typical cognitive therapy approaches, but that would be harder to do in school, obviously, in the context of math. Other things are just writing down, students writing down their feelings and sort of being able to do journaling-ish type activities. So that's been done as well in the classroom. But again, I think if we first don't understand where the students' skill gaps are, and if the skill gaps are the source of that math anxiety, then that's one of the things we need to focus on. Because again, it's that the data say that that this is a bidirectional relationship. So it could be that the poor math skills are leading to the math anxiety. It's possible also for it to be the other way around. We don't have evidence which one is necessarily more powerful or more expected, although there's one study by Gunderson and colleagues that said that it's more likely that it's going to be the math skill issue that's leading to the math anxiety. But again, that hasn't been found in more than that particular study. So hopefully that provides some answers.
That is very helpful. Rebecca in the chat, thanks you for answering the question. Kind of like going along with that. So you said it's like really important to identify these skill gaps. Do you have some practical ways to do that? What are some of the ways that you work with teachers to identify those gaps?
I mean, the first thing is to ensure, this goes back to the whole rationale for why we began this work. Just from what my students were trying to do is identify those skills using the tests and tools that we have available. And they were unable to do so. So the first thing is, do we have good universal screening? And with good universal screening, we can identify whether there are those class or school gaps. And if it's more student-centered gaps, then we can do some more investigative work and to drill down a little bit more. I like to use curriculum-based assessments. That's what I've used forever. And I like, there's general outcome measure types, and then there's sub-skill mastery measures. And I use both of those to really kind of drill down and identify using a skill scope and sequence chart that, which areas are mastered, which are not mastered. And if you follow that skill hierarchy, you can see pretty clearly. And after a while, that you can identify the patterns too that you might expect. So a student in 5th grade who's unable to engage in higher level math, well, there's multiple skills that we can look at that could be missing, but most of the time it's multiplication. So you start to see patterns in your own, once you start engaging in that database practice.
Yeah, for sure. You mentioned 5th grade, Robin, which is apropos for one of the questions that's come in from the chat. So I'll open this up to both you and Matt, but Paulo asked, what advice do you have for a 5th grader who has just been identified with dyscalculia and they were recently diagnosed in 5th grade? So I think identifying those like skill areas, especially multiplication, division, fractions, those are probably going to be on the hit list. But what other advice might you have for that 5th grader or the caregiver or the teacher of that 5th grader? Matt, do you want to take that one first?
Well, I'm not sure beyond what we've already said, and that is this: the label doesn't really tell us much. Dyscalculia, dyslexia, whatever, doesn't really tell us much to do for that particular kid. There's lots of reasons why that kid could be experiencing math problems. So I usually take the scope and sequence of the 5th grade curriculum, because it's a good place to start, and do these little 2-minute assessments that Robin's talking about. And I'll go to mathfactcafe.com and create a little, quick little assessment of each of these. It's pretty easy to do. A CBM, CBA. There's no such thing as a single skill CBM, in my opinion. But get a single skill CBA and try and get a sense of where that kid is having holes. and build it from there. Like it's going to have to come all the way down to that level of specificity. Now, you may have to go back in earlier grades too, get objectives, skills sequences from earlier grades, and work all the way back to find out. I work back until I start to see a pattern of instructional or mastery level skill, and then you can start there and start working forward. But I'm going to really dive into those individual skills and see what the kid can and can't do.
Robin, anything else to add before we move on to our next question?
No, I was just going to say, Matt really unpacked that well. That's what I was trying to say. And that's exactly the process that I engage in. So, starting in 5th grade makes sense because that's the grade, that level that the student is in. And then you continue to go backwards because you really want to identify what that student knows. And sometimes that means you're continuing, through different grade levels. And then I think the only other thing I would add is that whole number proficiency is really important. If you want to think about big buckets, whole number proficiency and then rational number proficiency. And in 5th grade, students really need to have solid whole number proficiency in order to really engage well in that those rational number tasks.
That is for sure. All right, we have 3 questions that we're going to load up here. One is about growth mindset. The next is about online programs, and the other is about universal screening. I think we'll take them in that order. So Angie has a question from the chat. Is there any research around growth mindset and math anxiety? Would either of you want to comment on this idea about growth mindset connected to or related to math anxiety?
I think there's more. So this is actually a topic area that one of my doc students is invested in, and there's much more on the relationship between math anxiety and math achievement than growth mindset evidence and math achievement. It's sort of considered part of this math anxiety, or maybe an umbrella to math anxiety. So I have to be honest, the particulars of that growth mindset literature, I am not as familiar with. I haven't delved into it.
Okay, yeah.
That's
okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I would just add that I thought the OECD PISA data from 2018, so that's that international assessment tool that's used. They said that, they found that 2/3 of students worldwide have a growth mindset already. And that study did illustrate a relationship between growth mindset and math achievement, but it seemed to have some mediation with teacher practices.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds like a good one to read. Matt, do you have any comments around growth mindset?
No, I Googled it, honestly. I went to Google Scholar and searched as you were talking, Rob, and I don't know any studies on it. I mean, I know what it is and everything, but I don't know of any studies. So I Googled it or Google Scholar it, and there weren't many studies.
Yeah.
Which is not
there's
surprising.
One study, I'll have to dust it off, but there's one study by Lynn Fuchs and her research team that I think just came out where they were running 2 competing math interventions, one which was just the math intervention and one which was a math intervention plus talk about growth mindset. And they ran these side by side for the entire school year. And they saw that the intervention with the growth mindset was beneficial to the students, but it was no more beneficial than the intervention that was just the math intervention. So I know that that's one that I've read recently, and I'd be happy to share that with people. But I think that might be I like it when people are experimenting these side by side instead of just doing growth mindset, without a math intervention tied to it.
And one of the articles I saw talked about setting up the school to have effective instructional practices under the guise of growth mindset. Yeah, you want to do that? Great, go for it.
It's good. Yeah,
call it growth mindset. Awesome.
Yeah, that's great. All right, we have a question here from Rebecca. So she comments that there's a lot of online gamified programs that have become really popular for addressing skill gaps. Some of those might be iReady or Reflex Math. Is there literature on whether these are better than more traditional interventions? And I'll think traditional interventions are probably like non-online gamified programs for addressing math skills. And then is there any research about these programs related to math anxiety or executive functioning?
So we have a meta-analysis on this right now under review.
Matt. Oh, great. Yeah, this question's perfect for you.
Where we compared, I forget the exact numbers, we compared technology-based versus paper pencil and versus other things. And if it was technology-based versus nothing or versus ineffective practice, there were large effects. If it was to a paper pencil type task, it was a much, much, much smaller, almost negligible effect.
Mm.
So we didn't see much benefit in doing it sort of online or electronically versus paper and pencil, but certainly better than doing nothing. I mean, but yeah, than doing nothing or ineffective practice. Now, I will say this, a couple things. Where I think it's advantageous is data collection, and that didn't come up in the study, right? The data are all collected for you automatically. They're usually stored. They're usually quite easy to access. So there's advantage there. It requires a lot less supervision. Having a kid at a computer versus doing something with the kid one-on-one or something. So it requires less supervision. So we saw an advantage there. I think you'd see an advantage there. But not all programs are created equally. I was observing a tier 2 math class one time. It was literally, unfortunately, it was a tier 2 math class, I don't know what else to call it. And these kids were in elementary school, and they were sitting there all on a computer and doing a math technology-based intervention. And I watched this one little girl, and she was completely engaged for 20 minutes, completely engaged, actively engaged in the program, but during the entire time, never did a single math problem. She changed her avatar's hat. She went and looked in each room, saw what was in there. So those types of activities that we tend to naturally, intuitively draw to because they seem interesting, engaging, may not be the best way to practice. I like thatquiz.org. I like Reflex is a good one too. Reflex is a good one. Reflex is not free, but it's quite good. And there's been a couple studies on it. Math Facts in a Flash, not free. A couple studies on it. Shown to be good effects. Now, there are good ones that for which there's research. There are free ones that look a lot like the good ones that are free, but probably haven't actually been studied, but very similar to the things that have been studied. I mentioned that quiz. Oh, Extra Math. Extra Math is the other one. Yeah. Extra Math and that quiz, both free, easy to set up. There's a benefit, I would argue, in terms of data collection. But when you look at the research, if you're doing good practice, good instruction anyway, I don't think you gain much benefit. But if that's not happening, then that's a nice way to build that in. Pretty easy way.
Thank you, Matt. That was a very thoughtful response. All right, Darlene has a question about universal screening. So are there math universal screenings that schools should invest in that are similar to DIBELS for reading, that look at each specific skill and that can be used as a progress monitoring tool?
Yeah, I mean, yes. There's a lot of different tools. So the National Center for Intensive Intervention has a lot of different tools listed. We call them CBM applications. There's tons of them out there that they vary in what they offer. They typically have early numeracy measures, computation measures, and starting to have more rational number type tasks. But I would say that's where it becomes limited when you're talking about doing the drill down that Matt was referring to earlier, which is why Matt and I make some of our own drill down tools. And then they can be limited because I feel like, Sarah, one of the things I keep wishing for is that there would be more word problem tools available.
Agreed, Robin.
Yeah.
Agreed. Yeah. Yeah, we definitely need something in the word problem realm that could be used for progress monitoring. It just is difficult. Often when we think about progress monitoring, we want those measures to be brief. And sometimes word problem solving is not a very brief activity, but you're right, we need some measures there in that area. So Darlene, if you haven't visited the National Center for Intensive Intervention, or the NCII, they have tools charts that can help you quickly look at some of the different math measures that are out there, and they can guide you to those specific measures and more about them.
Let me jump in one quick comment.
Yeah, go for it,
Sarah.
Matt.
Remember, there's different purposes of assessment. Screening is a very distinct purpose. Progress monitoring is a very distinct purpose. They're two different assessments. Diagnostic is a third one that I think is highly important in intervention. And I rarely see a measure that can do all three well. Robin already mentioned, sure, these great word problem solving, that'd be a great way to screen, perhaps. I guess I shouldn't say, I don't know. But if, let's say a kid doesn't do well on screening of word problem solving, there can be 15 different reasons why. So it doesn't really tell you why. And some measures like MAP, measures of academic progress, STAR math, those are fine tools. They're fine screeners, but their subtests, their domain scores and all that, those are based on item response theory. And sometimes students can get a score on that with only completing 1, 2, or 0 items on that particular domain. So those domain scores can be unreliable for individual kids.
Hmm.
So if the map says, well, your kid needs work in this, I'm not so sure that might be measurement error. Now, if the map says your kid needs help in math, then I have confidence in that conclusion.
Yeah, I think Matt raises a really, really great point, and he's absolutely right about those tools. So we have universal screeners, and that's going to tell you, like Matt said, if the student is at risk or not. And if they are, then you need to use additional tools that are more sensitive to change over time, that will be good progress monitoring tools that, cover fewer content and a deeper dive into it to really understand what's happening.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so getting into the progress monitoring world, a question has come into the chat. So can you speak to using single skill or mastery measurement versus general outcome measures for progress monitoring? And the question kind of boils down to, is there really a good general outcome measure for math? And I know that people in the field disagree on this. So Angie, you'll get one or two perspectives, but I think there are other perspectives out there. But Matt, do you want to give that one a try?
Yeah, Robin, you're on that paper? You're on that paper, weren't you, that we just published at PK?
Yep.
Yeah. We just wrote a paper on this. I've been, Amanda, Vanderheen, and myself, Robin, was Corey on it too, I think? Wrote a paper on this, and we've been saying for years, there's really no good GOM for math. And I would argue
you mean
that,
general outcome measure?
Thank you. Yes, sorry, general outcome measure. Thank you, Sarah. General outcome measure. There is not really a good general outcome measure for math. And really what you have to do is assess progress in the individual skills, see master the skill, move on to the next one. Now, I don't think anyone would argue against some sort of general math assessment, on a regular basis, once a month, certainly every 3 months, but I don't think anyone would argue against that. But if you want to see week to week progress, you really have to look at, to meaningful progress, you have to look at the individual skills. And again, I come back to the purpose of assessment. If you want to look at screening, the combination of skills makes more sense to me. But to progress monitoring or diagnostic, I really question the use of general outcome measures.
Yeah, and so obviously I have the same school of thought as Matt. You can already tell based on how we've been answering these questions already. I would just add one thing that I think is an interesting way to think about progress monitoring. And I think this was a recommendation from the RTI math practice guide that was led by Thurston and colleagues in 2009. But they did talk about progress monitoring two ways. So you would have more consistent progress monitoring in that mastery measure that Matt's referring to, and then periodically measure the GOM to see if you're getting some transfer. And I think that's a good, when I talk to schools, I mentioned doing that kind of practice as part of the regular progress monitoring planning.
So it seems like there's no one measure that can do it all, right? So it's a combination of measures, and that makes a lot of sense to me. All right, another question that's coming in the chat is from Adina. And so going back to your comments earlier about growth mindset, when we were talking about that and math anxiety, would you consider growth mindset a latest educational fad? Do either of you have a comment about that?
Probably both of us have a comment about that.
All right, Robin, you're first.
I get to go first.
Yes.
I was silent on the last one. So I've actually been part of a bunch of scholars and students who've really tried to tackle that and investigate it. To me, so that's where I started. It's a fad. Let me understand where this is coming from. And let's see what is the thing that people want to do that maybe we already know how to do, but we're not employing very well. Like how to get kids motivated and engaged in their own learning. And I think that's the thing that we really want to be focused on. And we need to provide a safe and supportive environment. So these are things that we've known for a really long time that we need to be able to do in schools. And growth mindset gave it maybe more importance because the term was utilized. But I always go back to those core ideas about how do we motivate, engage, and create, supportive learning environments for students. And it's using practices that we actually already know a lot about.
Thanks, Robin. Matt, do you have anything to add to that?
The only thing I'll add is on fads in general. A great book I recommend by Arthur Ellis called Educational Fads, Educational Innovations. He talks about how to differentiate an innovation from a fad in education. He talks about there needs to be three things. It has to be developed from sound theory or consistent with learning theory, has to be shown to work really well under tightly controlled conditions, and has to be able to be applied with effects, positive effects in practice. Like look at character education. Why do you have the 7 pillars of character? Because a group of people got to get together in Colorado and came up with them. No learning theory, no theory, and I would argue that was a fad because of that. So, if you really want to think about is it a fad or not, take a look. Is it consistent with learning theory, what we know about human learning? Is there research under tightly controlled conditions that says it works? And is there research out in the real world that shows it works? And if it's not, I'm skeptical. If one of those three things aren't there, I tend to be skeptical.
And what was that book again, Matt? People may want to check
It's
that
called
out.
Educational Innovation by Arthur Ellis. The latest edition had a co-author, and I forget the co-author's name.
Okay.
But it's Arthur Ellis.
And we'll put that on the YouTube link when we put up this webinar. And Jody just had a question. Can you list some of those good websites again? So I think we were talking about the National Center for Intensive Intervention. That's always a really good go-to. Were there any other good websites related to anything we've been talking about that people should check out?
Well, we mentioned Extra Math and thatquiz.org are two good ones. Sarah, I'm going to plug yours. What's the website I shared? That's so cool that you have. Remember I shared that YouTube discussion that once?
Oh,
remember?
What is that?
Oh, shoot. I'm
Well,
sorry.
it's your webs. It's like the Facebook group or?
No. Remember you have a website?
Project Stare, our middle school
Maybe,
math project?
maybe.
Okay.
I don't remember.
I don't know. I'll have to think about it and we'll put it in the link.
Yeah,
Yeah.
good.
Okay. All right. Well, it is 45 minutes past the hour, whatever hour or time zone you are in. We will go ahead and finish here. You will see a recording of this webinar up on the YouTube channel probably tomorrow or Tuesday. And again, in the description for the webinar, you will see a lot of these links to the studies and websites that we have talked about this evening. The Science of Math thanks you so much for joining in, especially on a Sunday evening. And we hope you all have a good start to your week. We'll see you all later. Bye.